She created what was called a settlement house. She was inspired when she went to England and saw that they had something called a settlement house, which this was a community center that provided social services to the poor. Ethan. Pull up your notes. Pull up your notes. I know it's right. Y'all don't. So the settlement house was this center that would help the poor. A lot of these poor in these the settlement houses is a community that gave classes to the poor, and a lot of them were immigrants, people living in these tenement houses. Do y'all remember the tenement houses we talked about yesterday?
Yes, one several people had lived in like, and they died from.
Yeah, a lot of diseases because the water and food was contaminated and stuff. In really poor conditions. And Jane Addams was like, okay, well, we see all these poor conditions, let's do something about it. So she gives classes to mothers of how to care for their children in these situations. They provide child care so the children could come to the settlement house while their parents are working. And they would also give baths to children, make sure they're clean, give them food, and she eventually opened what was called the Whole House in Chicago. This created the idea of a social worker.
So she helped people, so basically they learn how to raise their kids.
Just like trying to help them in the environment. So not that they didn't know how to raise their kids, but to help them do it in the environment, especially since a lot of them were immigrants, they were coming into a new place, they were trying to settle, they were trying to settle in, be comfortable, and she wanted them to do it home. Of course, women at this time were fighting for rights and education and stuff. But Jane Addams was a very educated woman. A lot of these women during the Progressive era, they actually do have an education, and that is why they get involved with these reform movements, because they have an education. They go into this knowing what they should do and need to do. But yeah, education, yeah. Which we talked about BSU, right?
You said somebody yesterday.
Yeah.
They would start out like a woman, like.
Yeah, the Valdosta Women's Normal College is what it was called. It was founded in 1906 to teach women, mainly to be teachers, but. This is what a settlement house looked like. You'll see on the right side, that is the community. All there, her picture. On the left side, you'll see that is their like child care. That's where they were.
It was a lot of children.
Yeah, a lot of children. Yep.
So,
But they didn't have very clean places to play, right?
wait, so this was the one that had disease and the whole house was the helping one?
Yes, Paul House was helping them. Yeah. Jane Addams was a part of helping like clean up the streets and make sure that there were just more sanitation. Yeah. This is the whole house, and on the right side you'll see that they're feeding children. Because a lot of these tenement houses did not have indoor plumbing. So a lot of them didn't have like actual baths. Okay. Does anyone have any more questions about women in reform movements? Anything like that? Okay. Let's talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, which led to the expansion of Jim Crow laws and the formation of the NAACP. Or Jim Crow laws. Let's rewind for a second. In the Reconstruction era, what laws were passed that would restrict African American rights?
Say it again?
13?
That's an amendment that actually gave them rights. It actually freed them from slavery. But what did they pass to restrict the rights of African Americans?
Black Code.
Or black codes, yes. Those were black codes to specifically restrict their freedom during the Reconstruction era. Yeah. And then Jim Crow laws, that was to support blacks and whites being segregated. So even though a lot of people confuse black codes and Jim Crow laws because they consider them to be like the same thing, but there is a bit of a difference. But sometimes they overlap with like the years that they were. Yeah. The Jim Crow laws were used for segregation. Black codes were used during Reconstruction. Yeah. Yeah. So once the federal troops were removed from the South after the Reconstruction ended in 1877, states enacted various laws to disenfranchise African Americans, which was to remove their right to vote, allowing black votes. Yep. Enforce poll taxes, literacy tests, violence, and the grandfather clause. Yes. So the name Jim Crow, it actually comes from a minstrel show. Do y'all know what a minstrel show is? No. Mr. Jack. The minstrel show in medieval times was like a little play that they put on, right? Yeah. Minstrel shows in America, there's actually a new form of like plays coming out during this time, and it would be where white people would actually put on blackface and make fun of black people by calling them out for being lazy and stupid and criminals and all those different things, and it was very prejudiced. So there was a character called Jim Crow. The person that came up with the Jim Crow character was actually influenced when he saw a slave that was disabled, and he put on blackface and started acting like a slave that would jump around and be jolly but kind of not quite there, if you know what I mean. And yeah, that's how it got its name as Jim Crow, and it became a derogatory term, and white people would refer to black people as Jim Crow, and it was offensive. It's like saying gambling. Yeah. I mean, they still say gambling, but like, you know, Jim Crow. Cool. Okay. But this caused widespread segregation, as you guys have probably talked about. We'll talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. And some people, like, they'll talk about ghettoization, with that segregation, like neighborhoods, restaurants, railway cars, cemeteries. Cool. During this time, when Jim Crow laws were being enforced, a lot of African Americans in the South, they got fed up with it, and they were like, we're going to go north for more economic opportunities. And eventually, Jim Crow laws, they were put into like federal laws by Woodrow Wilson when he was president. But a lot of them fled north because they weren't as strict as in the South. So they found economic opportunities in those factories, and later it would be called the Great Migration. Have you guys heard of the Great Migration? That's when, over a period of time, a lot of African Americans migrated from the South to the North. And you can still see that today. There's a dense African American population in a lot of places in the North. I think we have time to watch the video.
Okay. So I need to.
Yeah, probably. I don't know how to do that on this.
Might be hard to.
If you've been there yourself, you can be there for the 1 in 3 kids growing up without a mentor.
This might be the song. Just to give you guys some pictures. started to be overturned. Yeah, so a lot of courts were like, okay, well, this is unconstitutional. Yeah. Yeah, so during the Jim Crow era, there was a lot of violence going on, right? A lot of lynchings as well. Do you guys know what the definition of a lynching is?
Killing.
Well, they were killing them,
No, but.
yes.
Well, some people would refer to it as a necktie party, some people would call it a hang,
Yes,
an illegal one at that.
it was. Usually there would be a mob of white people that would come together and take matters into their own hands and would kill someone. But Brooks County actually has a bit of history with the
Yup.
violence. Have you guys ever heard of it?
Her name was Mary.
Yeah, Mary. Yeah. She was advocating for her husband being killed in 1918.
Yeah, they killed her baby.
Yes.
What's her
Yeah, that was pretty
baby?
violent. But there was actually, that was in 1918, but in 1894, there was actually a party of a white mob that got together and killed 5 black men because they were like, they're murderers, we're going out, we're finding criminals, and they found these men and they murdered them. And then they carried on with that like, type of massacre, some people call it, or the race war going on in Brooks County, and that continued from Brooks, sometimes in Valdosta. So there's a long history of violence, so you can see that, we'll talk about it when we get to like the civil rights movement and all that stuff, about how the Jim Crow era is. So Plessy versus Ferguson. This case was in 1896. Homer Plessy, he was 1/8 black, but they still considered him to be just black. So when he tried to sit on a railway car, right, in where the white people would sit. And he was trying to challenge the law of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal. Oh, sorry, that was after. He was challenging the law, but he was arrested for refusing to leave a whites-only railroad car, because usually colored people would sit in the back of the railroad cars. Yep. But the courts upheld the constitutionality of the Jim Crow laws, and then they said, okay, it can be separate, but it needs to be equal. Do you think these facilities for colored and white people were equal?
No.
No.